and I am assistant professor and head of theater here at UNM. And I'd like to echo my colleagues' thanks to Shubhankar Banerjee for his incredible vision, and not only his vision, but the tremendous efforts that he put forward in organizing this conference. Yes. I'd like to also pick up on what has become a leitmotif in these introductory remarks, and that is the origin story of this conference. Shubhankar also came to me and told me about this, but I did not think he was crazy. And that is perhaps because I was, at the time, organizing a symposium on indigenous performance titled Decolonial Gestures. And that is a conference that will take place on May 5th and 6th. So if you are in New Mexico, I encourage you to look at the full program, which you can find on decolonialgestures.com. But what I am most thankful for to Shubhankar is for bringing together this incredible array of guests. I know that this conference has been incredibly impressive, also in the sense that it has already left a mark on me, and I know that it will continue to make itself felt, I think, in future collaborations and conversations. So thank you, Shubhankar, for that. I'd like to introduce the speakers, our final speakers of the conference. Our first speaker is, we decided to go with Lynda or Manuela as the first speaker. I'm sorry? Manuela. So our first speaker this afternoon will be Manuela Picq, who is a Lowenstein Fellow and visiting associate professor in political science at Amherst College. She's a professor of international relations at Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. Her research tackles indigenous politics and sexuality in world politics in Latin America. She's also co-editor of Sexualities in World Politics and Queering Narratives of Modernity. She has held research positions at the Freie Universität, the Institute for Advanced Study, and the Woodrow Wilson Center. Her publications appear in scholarly journals such as Latin American Politics and Society, Cahiers du Genre, and International Political Science Review. She contributes to international media outlets and is currently editor of Intercontinental Cry. Our second speaker is Lynda Mapes, who is a writer and environmental reporter for the Seattle Times. She's also author of Elwa, A River Reborn and Witness Tree, Seasons of Change with a Century Out. And that book is a product of two residencies, one at MIT and also at Harvard Forest.
Hi. Can I close this? Thank you for the opportunity. I'm nervous because when Kyle talked, he gave me an orgasm intellectually, and I feel the pressure to give him one too now. I think you can. Gracias a los territorios aquí, Manaya. Good morning, everybody. I wanted to start by remembering the people who died this week. And as I was flying here on Wednesday, Gerson Acosta, who's an indigenous mayor in the Valle del Cauca in Colombia, was assassinated in his resguardo of Quitequiwe. And just last week in Colombia, as we speak. One of the organizational defenders is Global Witness. In population, there are over 40% of the people killed the last 2 years for defending the rights of nature. And just this year, Global Witness has recorded already 60 killings. That's 4 people every week. And a lot of that happens in Latin America. So I guess what I'm going to ustedes a América Latina un poquito. So a note on self-location. I'm French-Brazilian. My mother is Brazilian and was a political exile during the military dictatorship in Brazil in the 70s, so I was born in France. Then we returned to Brazil when democracy returned. Since 2004, I've been living in Ecuador as a scholar, and since 2011, I've been doing journalism. And the last couple of years, I was writing with Al Jazeera English, things that the government of Ecuador didn't really like. For instance, the father of the vice president raping the 11-year-old daughter of his maid and impregnating her, and nothing happening about it. So I wrote about it, and the rapist was detained for a week after he disappeared, but the government didn't like me very much. Another thing the government didn't like about me in Ecuador was the fact that my partner, Carlos Pérez Guartambel, is an indigenous activist, an indigenous lawyer, an intellectual, and he's a water defender. He's been defending the highland waters from Quimsacocha in the south of Ecuador in particular. And the last couple of years, he's been elected the president of Ecuadunari, which is the oldest indigenous organization in Ecuador. And the highland has a very big mobilization capacity in the country. So the two of us were not among the favorite people of the government, let's say. So I'm going to tell you my story a little bit, not because it's my story, but because it's part of a larger story of dispossession. And the thing that I'd like to think about is stateness, and to propose to you that stateness can only be thought as land grab, and that we need to switch political theory in that direction. So in August 2015, a year and a half ago, we were in a protest with the indigenous movement that was about the rights of nature and water, but that was more broadly also about political electoral democracy, and that was opposing the indefinite re-election of the president. And Carlos and I were detained by the police. We were encircled, we were beaten. I was beaten on the face, I lost vision on the left eye, came back a couple of days later. And during the night, while I was at the hospital recovering from the beatings under police surveillance, the government revoked my visa, and I was expelled from Ecuador. I mean, I was first jailed, so they put me in a jail the next day as an illegal immigrant. And of course, you never put a journalist in the jail, because by the next day, of course, the journalist knows everybody who's in jail illegally in there and sends the information to the newspaper. So it became a big deal in Ecuador, the 5 days I spent in jail. The government ended up, because of indigenous mobilization, academic mobilization, and media visibility, they ended up freeing me from jail, but they never reinstated the visa, so they de facto expelled me from the country. So I left thinking that it's impossible, right? Because you never realize you're being dispossessed of your life, that you won't go back home, that you won't go back to your apartment. So I left with a little backpack, thinking it was going to last a couple of weeks, and now it's been almost 2 years. It's going to be 2 years in August. Sorry. And during the days I was in jail, it wasn't only me. I was the first one to be detained, but there were many other people detained after. The authorities, like Carlos, my partner, were beaten and just kept for a couple of hours in the streets and then freed, because they're too big names to be detained. Indigenous politics is pretty big in Ecuador. There's an indigenous party and everything. It's not a thing of the past, right? It's a problem of the present. But many other people, while I was in jail, the government declared a state of exception and invaded a lot of indigenous villages and homes and territories. There was a militarization of the Amazon that kind of continues until today. Indigenous peoples in the Amazon region, because of oil, are living under permanent militarization, very similar to the Teo Nation here. In Saraguro, 120 people were detained. Women were dragged by their hair, raped. Men were jailed. Most of the accusations were a crime of resistance, even though it's a right in the Constitution. So I give you that as a context, just to think a little bit the legacy of a leftist government in Latin America. This happened under the watch of President Rafael Correa, who's a left-wing socialist intellectual. He's a scholar too of economics. president, and it's within the context of the New Left and the Bolivarian governments that are going to free us, right, from the bad imperialist United States. So when I was detained, the case was taken by the media, partly because I'm a journalist, right? So there is media solidarity. My colleagues immediately covered it a lot. But also because I'm white, and it's kind of normal that indigenous people get beaten in Ecuador. It's less normal that a white academic with blue eyes, right, La Francesa, gets beaten and jailed with the Cubanos who are coming to steal our jobs in a jail that nobody even knew existed. And then the other thing that happened, which when the government really shot itself in the foot, I think we say in English, is that the Joan of Arc of Ecuador is Manuela. The liberator for the Independencia, Bolivar, was partnering with his lover to do the revolution, who was called Manuela Sáenz. And there are two other Manuelas. And Manuela is a name that echoes with Joan of Arc. That's a name of woman, de libertadoras, right? Revolucionarias, and liberation from the crown, right? From the colonization back in the 1800s. And now it kind of echoed, like, people started referring to me as the Cuarta Manuela, the fourth Manuela, liberating from the dictatorship we were living under, right? Being with Carlos Perez, who was the indigenous liberator who was getting us free from the dictator. This dictator is on the left, right? And that's the irony of the story. So of course, I tell that to say why it became so famous, and also the racism in the whole story, because the government arrested me for daring being with an indigenous authority, right? It's Pocahontas in reverse. But people abided to the story, and I became a hero because it's so convenient to have a white foreign Manuela who's an academic, because there are many other Manuelas being detained and beaten and jailed in the Amazon who do not make it to national media. And as Shubankar said to a couple of people already mentioning the case, it was on CNN, BBC, The Guardian was talking about it momentarily, right? But it became big because I was not indigenous, right? So I became a national symbol of liberation, even though I am the opposite, right? And on the enemy side in every sense. When I arrived in Brazil, so I took an airplane and I went home first. In fact, what happened is that after they freed me, we thought with the lawyers that we would, Carlos was my lawyer actually, but everybody volunteered because it was such a public case that everybody wanted to be my lawyer back then. We thought we would try to get my visa, me staying in Ecuador, even though it was illegal because I was so public that they wouldn't jail me again. But then the Minister of the Interior declared that the courts would not decide over my case, that he would decide. So it became very explicit that the judiciary was in the hands of the executive, as has happened many other times in Ecuador. So I took the first plane I could and I went to Brazil, so I wouldn't go back to jail. And when I arrived in Brazil, who received me at the airport was one childhood friend, my mother, and all of her friends. So all the people who were at the airport were my mother's friends, and they were very scared and worried, and which I understand because they were from the 70s, and at the time people were being tortured and thrown from airplanes, right? It's the Pinochet era. They grew up in that, so that's what they had in mind when I was jailed. None of that happened. Once I was jailed, I wasn't beaten. But then, when I arrived, they were very relieved, and one of them was crying, and I went to hug her, and I said, it's okay, now I'm out, which inside me I was like, okay, now this is the beginning. Everybody thinks it's over, but for me it's the beginning, right, of this exile. And she said, no, it's not okay. It's not fine. You're safe, but we failed, because for 30 years we were fighting for democracy and for the left, and this is what we have. And now our daughters are, being exiled in a way like we had to live in the 70s. So I really started thinking about this idea of we failed, and where did the left fail, and all of these leftist social movements and intellectuals who supported the left and the arrival, for the last 20 years of the new left in governments in Latin America. And I thought at the beginning that my story was a story of exile, But the more it goes, the more I realize it's a story of dispossession and the story of indigenous peoples, right? Because you don't dispossess only territory, you dispossess social fabric. That's a story that has been told over and over the last couple of days. You dispossess knowledge, you dispossess political authority, right? You break all of that in every form you can. The state does. So I wanted to make 3 points. First, this idea of we failed, the leftist intellectuals are starting to recognize, the failures of the left in Latin America at last. Noam Chomsky talked about it a couple of days ago, I think. Raúl Zibeki in Uruguay also talked about this false polarization between the right of the left, which is killing a lot of people in Venezuela this week, for instance. Because at the end of the day, the left we have in power now is equally violent, it's censoring, it does not believe in electoral democracy, it's bypassing elections all the time, manipulating votes. The latest, I don't know if you saw, but in Venezuela, the president didn't know he can't win on the election, so he suspended elections until further notice. In Bolivia, Evo Morales declared that there would be a new referendum because the referendum he lost was, people didn't really know what they were doing, so let's vote again. Make sure you guys vote for the right people this time. So they're just manipulating. The extractivism continues and actually has been increased. Corruption is high and is being denied. So this appropriation of public good, this use of the state for personal profit and accumulation continues. And all of that is right. Like the left failed because of all of that, because of censorship and the violence. That's not the same as in the Pinochet era. I don't want to compare it to the military dictatorship of the 70s. But it's along those lines, right? It's kind of like the contemporary equivalent. But then there's something else with this. So I think beyond that we can see in my world, my non-indigenous friends and family saw it with my exile, that there was a problem with the left. But what they didn't see, and I think what a lot of intellectuals could not see, the failures of the left we couldn't see for decades because of racism, is the problem of the left as being extractivist and perpetuating extractive industries on indigenous land, treating it as terra nullius as usual, right? So the left is invested in progress and in development, right? The cepalismo de los años 70, el estado desarrollista, right? So the difference is that you do the extraction of oil in the name of the people, and you redistribute, supposedly, which there's some redistribution. But it has almost enabled more extraction, right? More licensing of the land, more intervention from China, if not the United States, in the name of that development. And in fact, there's a reprimarization of the economy that's pretty clear in Latin America. Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia have over 90% of their GDP based on extractive industries. And in Venezuela, I think it's 96%. Ecuador is 92%. It's oil, right? Some mining. In Brazil, Argentina, there are other industries, but the extractive percentage is growing too, everywhere. Actually, whether it's the right or the left, it's growing everywhere. So the energy boom has led to more extractivism. And even though we had leftist governments, it didn't change the paradigm of what development is, what well-being is, even though there's the summa causae in government and constitutions now. And just to give minor examples, in Ecuador, there's major criminalization of indigenous peoples. In Ecuador, there's over 1,000 people, halfway. In Ecuador, there's over 1,000 people who are criminalized, charged with sabotage and terrorism and things like that. A lot of indigenous peoples are killed, right? Because Moita was just expelled. Carlos, my partner, was jailed 3 times under this government, and the last time he was accused of altruistic terrorism because he was defending water. It's actually on the court's documents. The Amazon is militarized. In Bolivia, Evo Morales repressed indigenous peoples from the Amazon, pueblos originarios in Chaparina, right, fighting against the road construction to take Brazilian soy out into the Pacific to export to China through their territories in the Tipnis, a territory he helped protect in the 90s now that he's president and lives on a state that licensed to self-finance itself. He's breaking it, you know, the protection of self-determination rights in the territory, and is violently repressing his own brothers and sisters. In Chile, Michelle Bachelet was elected with the support of indigenous women in particular, and she used terrorist laws created under the Pinochet regime to put Mapuche water defenders and forest defenders in jail. And examples abound, and I can give you more later. But maybe the idea to which I wanted to go is that our mistake was to think that the left could be a savior and that the left could be a solution. Because then we stay within this very French, if we go back to the French Revolution, right-left paradigm. And the problem is not the right. The left also is the problem, and the real problem is really the state. And state-making, especially in the Americas, the history of the state is the history of dispossession, right? The state started with Potosi, extracting silver, and the state continues to license territories to self-finance itself. You can change the elites within. It's like the Trojan horse, right? So I wanted to give an example of Guatemala, the history of dispossession in Guatemala, la historia del despojo, to make this point that the state is and can only be extractive, especially in the Americas and Latin America, because that's how it finances itself, whether it's the right or the left. So in Guatemala, if we look at the history, it's a paper I wrote with Juan Castro, who's a Huacateco lawyer in Guatemala. There are 5 moments of despojo. Despojo is like dispossession, but it's not really the same. It doesn't really translate in English, but that's the idea. So a first moment of despojo, if we think about the arrival of the crown, Spanish crown arrives, they take over territory. But there is a negotiation because there are many political systems, governments with authority, with a lot of people, with a lot of sophisticated, complex politics established. So the crown has to negotiate the space, right? And the crown appropriates certain spaces, but recognizes the strongest Maya governments. And some have to buy their land in order to get titles. Others are able to impose their authority in diplomatic negotiations with the crown. But throughout the 1600s, the Spanish colonizers recognize a lot of Maya territories, and they give, in their own Spanish legal system, collective land titles called comunes de indios, que también hay en otros lados, no solo en Guatemala. So these comunes de indios are not just land titles, they're communal land titles, so they're territories within the territory of the crown, right? And the oldest in Guatemala is 400 years old, and they still have the paper, and the paper is protected by the ancestral authorities in a little box, together with a fabric of cotton, which actually in the Indian Museum in Washington, there's some of that too, right? This idea that fabric is where you keep knowledge and authority. And these comunes de indios were recognized politically too. They were not just territory implies politics. So the crown recognized municipios indígenas. And until today, when you go through Guatemala in the villages, you can see on the little square, the church, the state municipality, and the indigenous municipality in a lot of places. Right? So there is de facto a plurinational form of government, right? There are multiple nations and governments living together. Then comes the emancipation from Spain and the Reforma Liberal, the liberal reformer of 1870 in particular. When there is independence, the Guatemaltecas who get free from Spanish influence, they're like, okay, now let's make Guatemala, right? And so it's not very practical to have these different territories that are autonomous, right? So how do we appropriate that land? Well, you transform communal land into private property. So the liberals, the nationalistic move, was to create the National Registry of Property. And the thing is, all the lands that were not claimed in that national registry were defined as waste, unoccupied land. And the state used those land, issued titles to that land, and gave those titles in faraway places where people were not claiming it to pay the militias who had fought in the independence war against Spain, right? So the state, again, a form of extractivism, is using the land to pay its debt, to finance itself. And then those who did claim, who recite coming and claim their territory, well, if you're inscribing it in the National Registry of Property, it's private property, so it ceases to be communal land, right? So you start having, by this bureaucratization of Guatemala and the state formation, you start destroying systematically and politically the possibility of other forms of government. And then another methodology that they used within that was to declare entire towns Ladinos. Ladino, it's kind of like mestizo, right? It's that you're mixed blood, so you're not real Indian anymore. And under that racist narrative of whitening for development, right, for progress, the government declared entire towns Ladinos. It's 1874, Ladinos por decreto. So there are decrees, like legislative decrees that are 3 lines long, saying, we declare that all of the town of San Juan de Zacatepeques and San Marco, it happened in many places in Guatemala, are now Ladinos, like we make you white. And what happened when you whiten through these bureaucratic policies, all of the communal property becomes private property, and therefore it can be appropriated. So you're constructing, through bureaucratic tools, the state sovereignty, right, the modern state sovereignty. So maybe they are the bad people, you know, because they're still liberals. So in 1944 come the communist revolution, and this is considered the most progressive government of Guatemala, with labor unions, peasants, students, right, lower middle classes, everybody's participating in the government. So then the idea was, let's make everybody Guatemaltecas. Ahora somos todos Guatemaltecas. So there is forced assimilation then. And the government forces indigenous municipalities to enter within the state municipality and give up their titles. Because now we're going to take care of you, right? Solve the Indian problem through assimilation. Then comes the war. I think a lot of people in the US hear about Guatemala through the war of the 70s and 80s. It was 36 years of very brutal war, and in the 70s we start seeing this idea of cleaning up land for development projects at the time by the government. So during the military dictatorship, one example is the massacre of Rio Negro, which was recognized at the Inter-American Court as a human rights violation, massacre, / acts of genocide. What was not recognized in the Inter-American Court, which is always the same story, is that it wasn't just a genocide. I mean, it was a genocide, right? But it was to clear up land so that they could access the river, because this specific community was defending the river against a hydroelectric dam. And once they killed everybody, they could build a dam, right, for the National Public Electric Company. So there is a lot of appropriation of the land for dams, for telefonia, cell phones, telephones, throughout the 80s, 90s. In 96, there is the peace accords. They're like, okay, now let's all be friends and make peace. And then the government continues with this democratic narrative of progress and development. So now there is licensing of indigenous peoples to sell the land to international investments. Cell phone continues. Thank you. Hydroelectric dams is the main thing. A lot of the electricity is used for mining, right? The Marlin mine, to give you an idea, which is in Guatemala, uses in 1 hour the amount of water that an indigenous family of campesinos uses in 22 years, just so you have a notion, right? So a lot of the water of the electricities, the rivers are dammed for electricity for the mines are polluting the river. So there's really, there are river wars going on in Guatemala, and indigenous peoples are resisting. And authorities, because a lot of these Territories and indigenous forms of governments, Maya governments, AMACs, have been destroyed, but some continue, right? And the 48 Cantones that has this 400-year-old title is still here, Solola is still here, with different legal titles to land and political sovereignty, but many still exist. And they're fighting and they're defending, and a lot of their authorities are being killed and jailed, right? So, for instance, Rigoberto Suarez was detained for 2 years on fabricated charges and then released, but he's advocating plurinational states and self-determination in Three Rivers area. So he has 13 charges, like criminal charges against him. He can't leave the country. He already got word that next he won't be jailed, he'll just be killed, like Berta Cáceres, right? Those are not exceptions, it's everyday life. And when you live in Guatemala or in Colombia, you never know who's going to be killed next. So whether it's colonial government or democratic or post-colonial governments in the Reforma Liberal, whether it's a dictatorship and war or a neoliberal peace, whether it's a communist regime or a right-wing government, the history of dispossession continues. And it's very active today and it's very acute today because the government is more than ever living on the selling of national resources, of natural resources, rivers, mines, everything. So I'll finish the story here, but I think this is the same story everywhere. What we fail to see is to see how indigeneity is a key site to think state sovereignty and stateness. I'm a political scientist, so we think about stateness and globalization, and everybody's thinking about the EU and the collapse of the EU and Brexit. Why aren't we thinking about dispossession of a form of state-making? Why isn't indigeneity a fundamental place and site to rethink the world and the crisis, the various crises that we face? And I think there's so much killing of indigenous activists and authorities in Latin America now, precisely because indigeneity is a site of powerful transformation, and that it's the survival of the states that's at stake. So to go back to nature and climate, right, and land, it's not about the climate, it's about the political opportunities that emerge, and the more we destroy, the more the state takes over and consolidates itself, the least we can visualize or experience these other forms of government. And it's like, I usually tell my students, imagine a new color. If we're to imagine a new color, first it's really hard to do, right? And two, if we can imagine a new color, it's very hard to express it to people. And it's the same for government. How can we think outside the state? The only place outside the state is indigeneity. And the only place where we can rethink the state and move away from this climate crisis and all the other ones, because they're not separate, is moving outside of the state. And not that indigeneity is going to solve all of our problems, but it's going to give us a position outside the state to start a process of self-reflection, self-criticism, to enable real profound change. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. How are you? Can you hear me okay? Yes. All right. Well, last panel, last speaker, you made it. Way to go. So, Subankar, I think I'm going to need a little of your help here. Need your password. I want to thank Subankar for gathering us. What a rich, rewarding time together to hear your stories, the gift of your languages, the gift of each of you has been so rich, and I know that when we all leave here, we're going to carry each other's stories in our hands, like water, and try not to drop even one little drop of those stories, because they've all been so rich. So I'm going to tell you a different kind of story in my time with you. I want to talk about the power of wholeness. think that I need some help getting this to show the way I want it to show. Thank you, Ryan. So we've talked a lot about loss and dispossession and things broken and things destroyed. I'm the environmental reporter at the Seattle Times, so a lot of my stories are about those very same things. But, you know, this story that I want to tell you is a different story. This is a story about a tribe, the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe, and people who supported them from many races, who came together to bring a place back to wholeness. So let me take you to that place. This is the Elwha River in Washington State. It is a short river, just about 45 miles long, steep, deep, ravishingly beautiful. It spirals off of Mount Olympus, as all these short glacial mountain rivers do in the Olympic Peninsula, and it rushes to the sea. Today, it rushes to the sea. That is after 100 years of being dammed. Large dams, hydroelectric dams. One of them built illegally back in 1910. Even in territorial Washington State, it was illegal to build a dam that blocked fish passage. For in Washington, the salmon are a sacred animal, a critical source of life, sustenance of spirit and economy for not only the native people, but everyone who lives there. There you see Elwha Dam. 5 miles from the river mouth, it blocked all migration of all ocean-going fish for 100 years to the home place of those fish up at Mount Olympus. So powerful, so big were those fish, the Chinook, the Tai, the largest Chinook salmon in Puget Sound. They could actually swim all the way to the foothills of that mountain. But for 100 years, their passage was blocked. The elders of the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe, of course, were never asked, never gave their consent when that happened, and they grieved the loss of those fish. Everything in their world when that dam went in. But they never gave up. What is the theme of our conference? It is resistance. It is resilience. It is revitalization. And it happened. If I leave you with only one thought, it is that change is possible. Change is possible. Change is happening. Remember this image as I go along. That is Glines Canyon Dam, right upstream from Elwha Dam. One dam wasn't enough. A second was built to create even more hydropower as industry began to thrive on the Olympic Peninsula. These dams were not built because people needed electricity, because there was no industry at that time. They were built to bring industry, to develop in this European money-centric view of wealth and industrial economy. And they did. Suddenly, a pulp industry, a paper industry, a timber industry roared to life. I want to give you a sense of the landscape. This is a spectacularly beautiful place. These mountains gift the snow, the water that sustains life in the Pacific Northwest. The Elwha, as I told you, is a short river, just 45 miles long, and it runs north to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the saltwater you see at the top of the slide. That's Lake Sutherland to your left. This is the river mouth, and where it meets the Strait of Juan de Fuca. For 100 years, those dams hoarded the sediment that was needed on those beaches, and so they eroded. They became bare cobble. When you walked those beaches in those days, your ankles would turn on the rocks. This is above the dams. This is the Elwha within the Olympic National Park. This is a large watershed. It's about 360 square miles. 3/4 of it is within the Olympic National Park, never ruined. That is why the reclaiming of this place by the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe for the fish, for their people, was such a gift to us all. It is an incredibly beautiful river. Because of the glacial flower, it has this teal green color. green of the trees, green of the moss, into the slaty green color of that river. And it is even more beautiful in winter. It also has a tiny, quiet beauty, the ballet of these little tiny bugs in a tiny, quiet back channel. So it is a grand beauty, a small beauty. I spent a lot of time with scientists on this river in order to learn the story of what happened when the river was dammed, how it changed its ecology, to write a book about its restoration, to write many, many stories in the newspaper. They were very generous to us as journalists, myself, a photographer, Steve Ringman, who took all these pictures. We went out with them, particularly in the side channels. The Elwha is a very powerful river. You can't even work in the main channel, even in summer. So we would go into the side channels to do the work. Basic science, really basic in this case. He's literally measuring the rocks. The purpose of that is to understand the substrate of the river and how it changes once you give the river back its flow. Taking the census of the fish in the river. What species, how many? This is very hard work, doing these surveys in these side channels. You're literally belly crawling over the rocks, identifying the fish, you know, turning your head out of the water and speaking to the person on shore who's writing it all down, all the way up into the ferns. I mean, really following these little side channels wherever they go. Electrofishing, you know, to try to really get a full sense of all the fish that are there. Sarah Morley is an ecologist who was very interested in all the little tiny lives in the water column that feed everything else, the little beasties and the benthos on which it all depends, the base of the food chain. And so she would put these nets in the river to catch the little tiny lives in the flow. Daniel Hernandez, he's now just about to get his PhD. He was an intern when we did this work with him. He's stretching a seine across the river in order, again, to sample the populations of fish. This is the biologist for the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe, Kim Sager-Fradkin, and what she's doing there is she's baiting a trap for otters with a steelhead head. She was interested in learning how the lives of the animals in this watershed changed once the dams came down and the animals got their own homeland back. I don't know if anyone noticed the bear. I put this bear here. I want you to think about the animal people. We've talked so much about the dispossession of we five-fingered people. The animal people were dispossessed as well, and she was very interested on behalf of the tribe of understanding how the movements of animals, what they were eating, their lives were changed once the Elwha, the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe got this river back. Birds. How did the lives of the birds change once the river was restored to its place and to its life? This is Jim Edelman from the Smithsonian Institution, and he's having a very hard time with his mist net, which he's stretching across this river in order to sample for dippers, an aquatic songbird that is obligate to the Elwha. Even going inland to sample songbirds to understand how did their diet change, how did their lives change once salmon were back in the river. All of this baseline research to understand before and after. I went on the river a day that they were just pounding rebar onto the shorelines in different places, GPSing them so that there would be reference points, again, for scientists in the future. I went on this boat ride because I wanted to feel the river. I didn't want to just stand on the banks or even in my waders in it up to here or up to here. I wanted to really feel its motion, and in these soft bottom rafts, I had that opportunity. I'm so glad I did it because this is what I learned. Going down that river in these boats, between the two dams, there's some current restored there, and you see this beautiful color. You watch the parade of rocks through this clear water. You feel the motion of the river. And then, as we approached the lower dam, the color turned to brown. The motion stopped. The river was stilled. I had to feel that to understand how profound the transformation of a dam is in the life of a river. I want to start at the beginning. How did it happen? This is Thomas Aldwell, and he looks just as he should, doesn't he? Here he is. He's Canadian, and he comes to Port Angeles, which is on the Olympic Peninsula, and it's the town that he was seeking to build up as a developer by building a hydroelectric dam This is from the frontispiece of his autobiography, which is very appropriately named Conquering the Last Frontier. What does he do? He sets out to purchase the land that he knows he's going to need for his reservoir, and he does it secretively so he can do it cheaply. And he begins construction. Incredibly dangerous work, of course. Here you see these workers on a platform up in the mountains doing this work in the early 1900s. And the river is not easily tamed. On this first attempt, the dam is blown out by this river, which is so very powerful, and they had not adequately secured the footing of the dam to the bedrock. This is Glines Canyon Dam, upriver, under construction. I want you to remember this tree. Notice the size of it. It is so large they can only put one of them on this flatbed railroad car. The purpose of these dams was to power industry, and indeed what they created was a thriving sawmill at the base of the hook, where trees this large were made into dimensional lumber, loaded into ships going all over the world. This timber industry goes on today, and this bond with an extractive industry, with which you're very familiar here in New Mexico, was one of the reasons why dam removal, even on the Elwha, where it made so much sense, was so hard and took so long. This is the powerhouse in the lower dam. It's an important piece of industrial history, which actually I really wish was kept. It was not. It was destroyed in place. Built during this industrial age in America where things were made right here and made grand and built to last. Those are curvilinear, that's a curvilinear black slate control panel, these analog dials. You know, this dam was really built in another age, and they had to it was hard to keep it working. They had to actually find a lot of local expertise of people who knew how to make parts custom for this powerhouse. Just an aerial view to give you a sense of how total the stoppage is. You could, in August, when flows were low, go and sit on these rocks, which I would do, and you could watch the fish still come back. After 100 years, they never gave up. They still came back to the foot of that dam, and they would point at that dam as if wishing to go up above where they knew they belonged. Eventually, they would circle for a long time, sometimes for days, turn around and go back down to what little piece of the river was still left to them. Of course, that kills fish. The water is too warm. The reservoirs hold the water. It heats up. Disease becomes rampant. These are, of course, killed Chinook salmon that the Wildlife Department is saving for sampling. This fish is actually at a weir. It's not in jail. It's just what it looks like. Chinook salmon were sampled as they came back to this river with a weir so that we would have a sense as a baseline of these fish in terms of what population they were at before dam removal. Very large fish. They are incredibly powerful animals. They're all muscle. This is Adeline Smith. She was a dear friend to me, Lower Elwha Clallam tribal elder. Adeline was born between the construction of these two dams. And so she remembered as a girl swimming in that river, feeling these fish bumping up against her. She would talk about how her family would on a summer evening go and sit along the river just to watch the fish come up. She was so generous in her teachings and telling me about what these fish meant to her people. She was critical among the voices who went to Congress to testify on behalf of the law in 1992 to take these dams down. And here are all these usual people, the lobbyists, the people we all see all the time, testifying at these panels. In walks Adeline. In walks her niece, Bee. Bee took the microphone first, and she said, "Those salmon are still there. I have seen them." And it just quieted the room. I watched the tape of that hearing, and there was a sense that something special was happening, a voice that had not been heard, the indigenous voice of this place on behalf of the indigenous animals of this place, resonated. The Lower Elwha Clallam tribe had not done a first salmon ceremony in many, many years. They had to prepare spiritually for the return of this animal to its place. And so they went across the water to Vancouver Island, brought this ceremony back, and began to practice it again right before dam removal. In this practice, each tribe does it a little bit differently, but the core concept is to weave a raft of cedar, always of cedar, and on it place the bones of the first salmon taken that year. Give the meat to the elders, take it back to the village, but give the bones back to the river as a sign of respect and to encourage the salmon people to come back because they will be respected and they will be honored. The morning that this ceremony took place was in summer, but there was a lot of mist on the river. There were a lot of songs. People brought their drums, their dogs, their children. It could have been any century. The Elwha has always had friends, and it had friends in 1992. That's why this bill passed. Here we have Justice Douglas and Robert Kennedy going for a hike in the Elwha. These are the Mountaineers. It's a hiking group out in Seattle. They've been around for 100 years. And you know, they used to go on these epic treks into the Olympics. And we at the Seattle Times would put these on the front page, stories of these people exploring in the Olympics. The Olympics are the wilderness that in Seattle you can see from downtown. You see these shining mountains and you remember this beautiful place that is there for you. Even if you are stuck in town, you can still go there. And so the Elwha has always had a mystique and a presence in the imaginations of people far beyond that place, and that was helpful. And so it finally came after the passage of the law in 1992, after 15 appropriations bills through Congress, after the whole dream almost died so many times, and people like Adeline Smith, B. Charles, the elders at the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe, what did they do? They resisted. They were resilient. They never gave up on their dream. They were going to have that revitalization. This is the pulling of the switch on the Elwha Dam to cut off the electricity, still those turbines for the first time in 100 years. This is the operator of the dam. He's walking out. His job is over. In the lunch sack, you see, he had his operator's manual and a can of spray cheese. I asked him, I know it's true. Notice the pegboard with the tools. I mean, there was a lot of love and care amid the people who worked at this dam. You know, they had worked there for generations. They had family members who had worked to build the dam. Port Angeles is a small town. In all of these communities where we make these changes, these profound changes in our economies, in our communities, in our landscapes, we're going to do this work together. He spoke of how he loved the fish, and I don't doubt it. Here's how it was done. You don't just pull the plug on a dam this big, 210 feet tall, Glines Canyon Dam, Elwha Dam, 105 feet tall. You couldn't just pull it out because there was 100 years of sediment backed up behind these dams. So, 1 foot per week, smashed down with just this one guy, can you believe it, on this piece of equipment, which is tethered on both sides very tightly, we hope. And then the river itself would equilibrate, rinse out the sediment, and then you'd take another foot out. Week by week, that's how it went. Very slow, very gradual, none of the catharsis that anybody wanted with a nice big blow and go. By the way, we got that on the white salmon. It's interesting, Washington State is a very hydropower dependent state, but we're also the dam busting pioneers. We've taken out 3 of the largest dams ever taken out anywhere in the world for fisheries recovery. Yeah, that's definitely worth applauding, and people have their minds and their eyes and their hearts set on a couple more. So what was so moving to me is the way the river came instantly back to its old channel. Here it is, with its old friends, the very same forest that had been along its banks back before the dams went in. I often thought to myself, what do they say to each other? I was cut, I was damned. You know they talk. Look how much sediment So much sediment. But you know, the thing that was so moving to walk on that sediment and hear the sound of the river again. And you knew, first the sound, then the salmon. This is Josh Chenoweth at the National Park Service. They ran this dam removal project because it's your property. This is the Olympic National Park. You know, he had what I thought was going to be the hardest job, which was the native plant recovery in this place. If you don't do something about 600 acres of former lake beds suddenly exposed, you're going to have what? Blackberry, Scotch broom, a bunch of weeds. So his task was to try to get a native plant restoration going. Look at the size of these stumps. Remember the large tree on the railroad flat car I asked you to remember? These are those trees. In my family, we call this Lynda on a stump. I'm sitting there to give you a sense of scale. It's bigger than a king-size bed. I laid down on it. There was plenty of room. It's an incredibly large tree. Do you see the springboards cut in the stump? This is Andy Ritchie. He's the hydrologist for USGS, and he's touching the original surface of that riverbed, finally exposed after 100 years. That beautiful color that you see is iron oxide that's brought up as oxygen once again touches these surfaces. And you could see it on the rocks everywhere. And I love this tiny new growth that begins to come once the water recedes and the land comes back. So many things came back to the people. The Lower Elwha Clallam tribe talked about how they got their creation site back, a place that their elders had spoken of, but none of the children had seen in their time, not their parents had seen. They began maybe even to wonder if it was true. And then finally, those floodwaters were drained away and they found that creation site. It came back to them. They found village sites. So much came back, so many ceremonies, so many songs. There were surprises in this dam removal. It was unprecedented. As I said, no one had ever done anything on this scale before, anywhere in the world. Some of the things that happened made it easier. There was so much moisture retained in those lake beds that it really helped the native seed rain coming down from the trees sprout. The cracks that gradually came as those sediments dried created a little bit of shelter for other seeds to sprout. The moss, the gift of the moss, created a little bit of surface roughness, again made it a little easier for growth to get going. The native plants gift us in so many ways, and they came back to this landscape so abundantly. The revegetation I spoke of, that was done in several ways. It was done with live stakes, raised in a greenhouse that was erected solely for this project from plant material, gathered, a lot of it by volunteers, from the very same watershed, right plant, right place. I thought the seeds were incredibly beautiful. These are the alder cones, these are the grasses, and these were some of the little tiny plants set out. You know, I was very skeptical about this. I thought, isn't that going to be a beautiful elk snack? Aren't they just going to come out and chow down? But surprisingly, the plants did a lot better than I would have expected. There was a very core controversy in the restoration of the Elwha. Many people hoped for a fully natural recovery with no hatchery influence. That did not happen. A new hatchery was built as part of this project. The reason for that actually was the tribe. With treaty rights to this river, they didn't want to wait the multi-generational time length that it was going to take to get to abundant enough fisheries populations to be able to fish once again. And so they wanted a hatchery. They already had a hatchery. A new one was built, and a stocking program commenced. But the tribe did something they did not have to do, which was a great act of generosity to the community. And what they did was they stopped stocking a non-native fish that had been stocked in that river for decades. Of course, nobody cared when it was just about, the river that they'd given up on. No one cared about stocking of those fish for the sporties, by the way, all those years. Suddenly they cared a lot when the dams came out and was like, oh no, you can't have a hatchery anymore. Here's what the tribe did. They said, we need a hatchery, we need it for our people, we need it for our economy, so we don't have to wait more than 20 years before we can fish again. But we're going to kill every one of those non-native fish on station, every one, and we're not going to plant them again. We will plant native fish from this place. That was generous. They didn't have to do it. Weeds are a problem. You cannot have reed canary grass starting to take over these lake beds. Those of you who work in restoration understand how pernicious weeds can be. The Park Service actually sprayed in order to keep these under control. That's pretty, but it doesn't belong there. But don't let these controversies, the hatchery, the weeds, don't let those overshadow the enormity of what was accomplished here. The revitalization of this beautiful river, the bringing back of these animals to their place, the bringing back by this tribe their stories, their creation site, their village sites, their place, their ceremonies. These fish are storming back to the watershed today. These fish will never again face a wall beyond which they cannot go. The native plants are coming back into this watershed. The animals, these elk finally have access to that critical winter range habitat, that lowland habitat that they need along the river. Eagles are back in the lower river in numbers that people have not seen in generations. Why are they there? They're there because the eulachon are back. These oily forage fish that feed the eagles are coming back in a chrome tide in the early winter months. The dippers I told you about, they are now feasting on the eggs of coho salmon. These dippers used to be migratory. Now they are year-round because they have enough food. Not only that, the females are bearing double clutches, and it's only been 5 years since dam removal. That is remarkable. This beach, so bare, so cobbled, that no one could remember clam harvesting as the old ones used to cherish in so many generations. Looks like this today. And I love this eagle just sitting there watching all the changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you both for such excellent presentations and compelling testimonies to your work, to your own work, and that of others. Yesterday, Dylan Miner invited us to, as he does with his students, to think outside of capitalism. And I take that prompt as an invitation to think outside of not only capitalism, but other oppressive systems, such as the colonial one, as we are doing here, but also perhaps more expansively to think beyond what we know, and which really kind of shapes what we can think and what we can do. And I wonder if you can speak from the perspective of your life's work, to how you might begin to address that question, right? Which is both, it could be a flight of the imagination, as we've heard, but it's also perhaps the imagination is necessary in order to enable acts, but it's also a practice. And I wonder if you can think about, if we can take the time to collectively think about what might be possible outside of these systems, right? Because we are not separate from these systems. Those systems are embedded in us and we enact them. We're actors of the system. So I want to ask you to speak from the perspective of your work to that. Are there any perhaps conceptual or theoretical frameworks that are useful in getting us out of these systems? And beyond the conceptual or the theoretical, are there methodologies that you've encountered that may be useful? I know, for instance, Manuela, your other work looks at queer theory, This is kind of a theme that hasn't really been discussed in much depth here, but there has been work done on this in this domain. I'm thinking specifically of Timothy Morton's guest column, Queer Ecology, which appeared in 2010 in the PMLA, but perhaps there are other, but perhaps it's the confluence of various queer theories, such as queer theory or others, and indigenous methodologies that might help us to think beyond the known.
Thank you. Yeah, on what Dylan was saying yesterday, I don't know if he's here, but I keep thinking, is it the state that brings capitalism or capitalism that brings the state, right? But it goes together, and when we talk about the Anthropocene, it's accurate, but it's, again, depoliticizing the whole story, right? And capitalism is the economic dimension, but the political dimension is the political arm is the state, right? And I think we need to, if we don't undo the state, we won't undo capitalism as it works now. The mechanism of accumulation is the state. On queerness and indigeneity, I think it's exactly the same thing because it undoes these borders. And I think what's in common between the queer and the indigenous is this undoing monogamy. The state is, of course, very monogamous, but the social fabric we kept talking about, right? How the monogamy and the state is this overinvestment in the nuclear family, right? As a site of production, as a relationality, when we've kept talking about relations throughout the various presentations. If we want to invent other relations, we have to disinvest from the couple and the nuclear family as the site of construction of the self, of wealth, of reproduction, right? So I think undoing monogamy would be a nice thing, and instead of talking about theories that converge, which of course they do, but practices that converge, I think the indigenous and the queer do the same thing as undoing this overinvestment in a certain relation that's derelational from the world around us and from water, for instance.
I want to pick up on Manuela's theme of relationships and say that this is about relationship. It's about our relationship with the beings seen and unseen, about our relations generations from now. It is about making kin. It is about making family with all of our relations. This river that, by the way, is supposed to be where we are sitting. It is about letting ourselves love this beautiful earth to which we are so suited. To love it not only in the faces that we already know, but in the faces that we still need to meet and connect with. Not only the people we agree with, but the people who give us pain in their example and in their words. Those are the people we need to reach. And we need to be inspired by our relations in the animal world, the tree people, the animal people, our teachers who were here long before. We very vulnerable, very, very vulnerable humans. So, relationships. We've formed so many relationships in these days together, and I hope that we stay together as we go forward into our work. But I hope we also reach out to the relations all around us in the natural world and know that our work is to stay close to those animals, those plants, this world that we must love in order to take care of it. So I do think it is about relationships. I absolutely do.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Yes. Please come up and bring your questions to the panelists.
Well, Lynda, I wish that everybody in Congress spoke like you, because then we'd probably pay a lot more attention. I love listening to you talk, but I have a comment, and I have a comment for you, Lynda, and I have a question for Manuela. And my comment for you is mainly just to thank you for your work and your writing, because you're writing, not just your presentation today, but you're writing over the years, like your dedication to this story really kind of shows me how I should behave in my practice, and not to just treat things as little projects, but to treat it as work and as being part of that story. So I think you're just as much to thank as everybody else in that project. So Thank you. And for Manuela, I wrote my question down because I wasn't sure how to word it, so maybe you can actually give me a better way to word it. But I was just wondering if, as a journalist, if you could shed some light on journalistic practices in Ecuador, if there's any unique differences in your experience, if you have much experience in the United States. Like, I wonder how much, the Fox News in Ecuador is paying their employees to sexually harass the female employees, stuff like that. And I was also wondering your opinion on, like, sensationalizing terms like terrorism to mask the realities of activities. Like, you mentioned Carlos, I believe his name was, and the idea of sabotage and him being arrested for trying to protect the water. So calling things like that terrorism to mask it with, like, a type of fear. And I was wondering if you could just kind of provide an opinion or a perspective on that.
And this is in Ecuador, but it's happening everywhere. Does that go? Yeah, I'll just hold it, muscle. It's happening in Chile, it's happening in Ecuador, it's happening in Peru. Although Peru has an interesting case. Governments accuse indigenous authorities of sabotage and terrorism because they become the enemies of the state, right? Echoing with Islamophobia and the other, which is one more examples or dimensions where we can see that indigeneity is displaced outside the state, that threatens the state for everything that it values. So I think it's a very strategic, and we can see that in a lot of countries, the laws that are being used to criminalize indigenous peoples are leftover laws from the dictatorships, but they're only used against indigenous peoples, right? And of course, they're framed as terrorists in their approach to territory, right? So there's this contestation of territoriality. So claims to self-determination end up framed as terrorism. And of course, in post-9/11 world, it justifies all kinds of violences, right? So it's also after 9/11 that this terrorism legal language becomes very common, right? So there's a global context for it, but it's always the enemy of the state. In terms of media, I mean, the media is problematic everywhere, and of course there's like right-wing media everywhere. In the specific case of Ecuador, there's a lot of censorship, Venezuela too, but the censorship in Ecuador grew much faster and quicker and much more efficiently than in Venezuela. We went from right-wing media, which I don't think there's anything like Fox News really anywhere else. Fox News is pretty, but there's right-wing, right, but more conservative, like banker style, Wall Street style. And we went from having maybe half of the main medias in those hands to having half of the media in Ecuador, 45% now, in the hands of the government. So under a discourse of public media, what we really have is a monopoly of state-owned media, which is very different from public. There are many laws throughout the Bolivarian states on redistributing, for instance, radio frequencies to indigenous peoples for communitary media. The laws exist, the redistribution never took place, right? They're still waiting for the frequencies since 2008. So there's a narrative that, very leftist and redistributive, but in practice there's an appropriation. And the mechanism is that since 2013 they passed a new law on communication that declared communication as a public good, un bien público. So if it goes against the public good, as defined by the state, by the government, then it can be censored and appropriated, as a punishment. So usually what happens is that if medias are in opposition to the government, then they are sued by the government. There is a new council called Consejo Nacional de Comunicación, I believe it's called, since 2013. And they are basically in charge of monitoring for racist language. So, it's kind of like the same journalists or opinion article editors or, cartoonists being accused of inaccuracy or sexism or racism, which would be great if that was the case, but again, there's this cooptation of good values, right, in the name of, but then under these, they're appropriating small medium. Not that they're forcing people not to be sexist, right, or the media. They're just using it as an excuse to appropriate. Yeah, state monopoly more than, but the media is problematic everywhere and it will be, right? The idea is how do we create more mechanisms of public accountability, like social accountability more than governmental control of the media?
Thank you.
Hi. So I'm really inspired by the work that both of you do. I think that accessibility is a really important issue, especially concerning the media. That being said, I'm finding it really difficult in sort of understanding this whole decolonizing theme. Is where do you strike the right balance between resistance of the system and coming to represent the system that we are integrated within? So basically, I guess, what power do I have to give back to the indigenous people, I guess?
Can you repeat it? How do you?
Yeah, what power do I have to give back to indigenous people is basically where that question was leading.
I'm going to take a stab at this. I was incredibly inspired by people who came to Standing Rock from all over the world, all kinds of people, butcher, baker, candlestick maker, students, elderly people, retirees, white people, brown people, yellow people, red people. The world was there. That matters. It mattered a lot, and it mattered in the moment, and it matters now, and it's going to matter in the next battle. We sustain one another in these fights. We make an example of what we will stand for and what we will not. Show up, stay there, connect, learn, and get ready for the next one.
I think it's about giving back, it's about listening, and that's what I've learned. It's like my experience in Ecuador, and that's why nobody can say, why do you want to go back to Ecuador? You are in the US, you have a nice car, you have a nice job, it's a good country, developed. But no, because here you're within the matrix, right? And once you start seeing differently, you don't want to be in the matrix anymore. And it's not about giving back, it's about just seeing who you are and where you stand. And then, you know, and then you'll know. Once you know, you'll know, right? It's very hard to explain a new color, but women's rights. How do we really want to fix women's rights within the states, with the history? You know, how do we want to fix climate change within the structures we have? And we won't get rid of the state maybe completely, because it's there and it's just too everywhere to get completely rid of it, but maybe this idea of Chakrabarti, of provincializing Europe, provincializing the states, right? And just being aware that this is just one form of government among many possible ones, that it's not the only way of existing as a citizen with a passport from your country. One of the things we did was indigenous passports with Carlos, to show you how racist the whole system is. So we made, when I was expelled, we were in court and they refused to give us the visa. So I was telling him, like, behind the other lawyers, like, the Iroquois, they have a passport, they're traveling with their passport, right? So, the Nassau passport, like, maybe we can do something along those lines to claim territory, and maybe you can give me asylum or something. Remember, we were trying to think in those lines. So he made passports, and he traveled with the Quichua passport to Peru, to Guatemala, to Mexico, and to Bolivia. And when we were in Bolivia, he gave me one, right, as his wife. So I entered Bolivia with a native passport. So I'm in Bolivia, it's 65% indigenous, okay? We're at the customs. We can't go together, the customs, so he goes on one side and I go on the other. I pass customs in 3 minutes, and the guy looks at the passport and says, I'd never seen this. And I get nervous, right? Because I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna get caught again, jail again. And I'm like, yeah, it's the new passport of the plurinational state of Ecuador, right? Indigenous people. He's like, oh, cool. Can I take a picture to show my friends? I'm like, sure. So he takes a picture on his cell phone, and he passes me through. Carlos, who looks indigenous, stayed half an hour there waiting, until I went to complain to my immigration person. What about my husband? He's not coming through. He's like, oh, let me go talk to my friend. And he talks to his friend, and they let Carlos through, the indigenous leader. Like, the racism is so profound, and it's so embedded in the institutions. But the problem is the state system in itself, right? And how can we liberate women? It's the whole story of the war in Afghanistan, right? Who are we liberating of whom, right? So I don't think it's not about giving anything, right? Instead of trying to save indigenous people, just consider that they're trying to save you, us, right? And just listen and look where you stand as a starting point, maybe.
And then decide where you stand and stay there instead, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, and then we're going to actually transition to a roundtable where some of the speakers and moderators will give reflections on the conference as a whole.
How do you deal with the idea that we'll never be in a decolonized world?
Well, I guess what I would say to that is, what's the point in giving up, right? I mean, that makes them win for sure. I mean, I think that it is each of our tasks to be inspired, make the most of where we are by working hard for the future. That is our job, each and every one of us, and it is not new. That has always been our job. And so don't give in to that. There's no time for that. Dig in.
I don't know if I'm optimistic or not, but change happens really fast. I would say that, and it might be really bad change because everybody is being killed and dying and etc. But who knows? You know, the iceberg may tilt the other way. But whatever catastrophic changes are happening now, it could go many directions. So I don't think we know the future. And I'll give that as an anecdote. In Quechua language, Pacha, everybody here is Pachamama, right? But Pacha is really the cosmos, and it's time and space together. So much for Einstein, that came later, right? But it's been in Quechua language for a while. And so if you say Pacha, it's like Kimsa Pacha is 3 p.m. And if you say, and Pacha is also the cosmos and the planet, and Pachamama, therefore, right? So in Quechua, when you're walking, in terms of time space, we walk, in our civilization, we walk like that. You walk like that. So the future and the back is the same word because you can't see the future, but you can see where you come from. You can see where your grandparents come from, right? Where you are anchored. And so we walk like that. And it's beautiful because if we get a lot of stress from trying to figure out the future, because, you know, to see where we're going. But if you start walking backwards, you just walk more slowly, and you don't think so much about the future, and you're more anchored in the past, I guess.
And I just had one other question. How do you deal with the fact that one day the entire world will be decolonized? I'm talking about much after human beings are gone.
Well, that's how it is, right? I mean, we've been there before on this planet. It's an adventuresome planet. It was all rock and ice, the whole thing, pole to pole. It'll happen again. Life itself is the most powerful force. The question is, what do we do with it?
With that, we'll walk backward to our next session. We are not taking a break. We're just transitioning very quickly, so I invite the respondents to please come up. And our last session will be shorter than the preceding.
So it's going to be decolonization, nature, and future. As Dylan Miner pointed out last night, decolonization is not a metaphor. Especially for indigenous peoples. And I often think that sometimes we think of nature as a metaphor, and I'll get to that in a second. But there was also talk today about how do we ecologize decolonization. And I want to think about that a little bit more, especially in the context of the structures of colonization as well as the structures of capitalism. Things that we can't avoid. We may be moving towards something that we want to think beyond the state or the capitalist state, But before we do so, we have to acknowledge things such as settler colonialism and capitalism that do define our sort of imaginations on what sort of a post-capitalist or potentially a post-colonial or decolonial future may look like. And that gets to the question of the future. If we can't, as somebody had brought up in a previous panel, if the only futures that we can imagine in popular culture are apocalyptic futures, what sort of service are we doing to ourselves and the future generations? But also questions of violence came up. I noticed that in the context of some of the discussions that were happening yesterday in this notion of decolonization. And I want to sort of re-invoke the spirit of Frantz Fanon again, and sort of point some things out, because Frantz Fanon was not indigenous to Algeria. He grew up in the Antilles, but he was also the product of forced migration as being the descendant of an enslaved population to work in the sugarcane fields, and then later went and fought in the war, for France to liberate France from the Vichy regime and during World War II, only to be transported in the cargo hold back across the Atlantic, just like his ancestors were transported in a cargo hold across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. He was transported in the cargo hold as a freedom fighter to France to liberate France, and then went to, went into psychiatry and then found himself in the Algerian Revolution. But people attribute Fanon's theory of decolonization as one of glorifying violence. And in fact, if you read his book, The Wretched of the Earth, people only read the first chapter, but the rest of it talks about the conditioning of the colonized as well as the colonizer around the questions of violence. And he was advocating for a sort of new humanism. And he actually abhorred violence and detested violence. And you can see that in his work. And so I want to think about that question about when we talk about decolonization, because when we think of things like Standing Rock and we ask questions of what is a just transition, we can see the ways in which the state deploys violence and the ways in which we, even to imagine or to demand clean drinking water or renewable energies, is met with an intense state violence. And then that gets to the question of nature. A lot of panelists were talking about the commodification of nature. Is it helpful to separate humanity from nature as an external thing? There's a kind of determinism in thinking about nature, i.e. sort of the innateness of humanity or life. Oftentimes we think of humanity or nature as we couple it with like, oh, that's just human nature. And we think of sort of market-driven economies as being like, oh, that's the natural sort of way of things, right? So how do we think beyond sort of this very deterministic structure of nature as something that can be challenged and potentially, as the theme of this conference is decolonized? It made me think about this movie called Get Out.
Oh my God.
As I was thinking through some of these panels, and how oftentimes these categories are very dominating and confining, and they can actually put us back into that sunken place where, as indigenous peoples, we're being talked about so much at this conference, but yet how is indigeneity? Somebody was saying, well, indigeneity is sort of the analysis of the state and sort of possibilities of a post-state future, but it's kind of like alienating in some ways to be sort of an indigenous person and seeing that to be like, can somebody inhabit indigeneity who is not an indigenous person? That's what I kept thinking about, and the movie Get Out came to mind. So futurisms, what do we do now? That was a common theme, and I think the last panel was really talking about this notion, this longer history of colonized peoples and oppressed peoples who have been saying for the last 500 years, this is what we want. We want land, we want dignity, we want humanity, and we want to live in correct and balanced relationships. But it's only at this critical juncture in which people find themselves in a crisis within a crisis within a crisis within a crisis that we can't even we kind of become sort of victims to that particular way of thinking, when in fact, if we look at the longer history of things, we can see visions of alternate futures or alternate possibilities that have only been accumulating over the last 500 years. This isn't a new thing for a lot of indigenous peoples, but I think the Trump moment exceptionalizes a kind of fear and uncertainty in which we are overloaded by crises, a continuation of imperialist wars, climate change, the hollowing out and gutting of the social welfare state. So when we talk about the future, how is it that we can imagine not just a decolonized future, but a decolonized past as well? And for the last thing on that, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists because this is like huge. Indigenous peoples are more than cultural identities. We are collective political entities. And settler society selectively engages indigenous peoples, but indigenous peoples and all colonized peoples engage settler society at all terms. And so when we think about that, how is it that how is it that settler society chooses to selectively engage indigenous peoples at specific moments, or colonized peoples or colonized knowledges at certain moments, but then at other sort of critical junctures chooses to ignore them or not see them as part of this overall picture? And with that, I'll turn it over to our panelists. Did I stay up here? I'm really tall and I kind of just want to like disappear. I'm going to go into the sunken place.
So how do we want to do this? Do you want to start?
Sure, I could start. So I think what I'll do is I will offer just some general thoughts that I think in many ways will kind of entangle with the thoughts that Nick offered as well, just trying to think about what have we done over the last 3 days. And the question was raised at the very beginning, what does this decolonizing nature thing mean? And I've been trying to think through that and trying to think of it in terms of what we actually saw, not necessarily in terms of what I would individually think about that. And it seems that a lot of the papers that we've looked at have asked variations on this question, like how they've considered how we might decolonize the relationships between what we might think of as the human and non-human world. Always understanding that they're so deeply entangled with one another that we kind of tease them out as kind of separate categories, only as kind of a heuristic sort of move, so that we can kind of begin to think about what those relationships are. How might we decolonize how we comprehend the relationships between the human and non-human world? And how might we decolonize space? Thinking of space as something that actually is an embodiment of all of these entanglements that we're talking about here. Space is something that in many of the papers that we saw are embedded within cultures or communities or embedded within politics or within power. I think one of the things that really kind of jumped out to me is that much of what got discussed here is not necessarily the good old-fashioned nature out there that many people looking at this poster might immediately call to mind, but really thinking more about kind of the human qualities of that nature and the human relationships, and particularly thinking about decolonizing as something that involves always human beings as well as the entangled non-human elements of their worlds. I've got a lot of different things that I could think about here, but I actually want to kind of open things up a little bit, so I'm just going to talk on about one or two of them. What I really enjoyed about this conference as a historian who works quite a bit with scientists and with social scientists was what art brought to the table. I think I learned a lot over the last 3 days about the role of imagination in all of these larger questions, ways that we can use the imagination to think about connections, to thinking about how the world is wired together. We've talked a lot about local connections, kinship, intersectionalities. And we've also talked about the ways in which there are contests and instabilities in the relationships among different groups. Inequities of power seems to run through most of, if not all of the papers that we've talked about during this conference. I thought, as a way of kind of pulling this together in sort of a concrete way, I thought about the three keywords of the conference: resistance, resilience, and revitalization. I hope I'm remembering those correctly. And another word came to mind, which I'm just going to throw out, which is revolution. But I don't necessarily mean revolution in the way that you might immediately think of revolution. There's really two meanings to the term, two basic meanings to the term revolution. And I think it's useful to kind of think about those two meanings within the context of a very particular problem that the first three terms might possibly set up. When I think of resistance, resilience, and revitalization, I think about the search for stability, and we've seen that as a theme in some of the papers. I think about returning to a world in balance. But one of the problems of thinking about that is also something that's at the very core of capitalism, and something that's at the very core of states and of empires as well. And what I like about the term revolution, if we could add that as a fourth term there, is it kind of brings a different kind of tension. On one hand, we, probably those of us in this particular audience, are immediately thinking about the term revolution to signify dramatic change, disruption. But there's another basic meaning of revolution, which is circular movement. And I think those two meanings kind of put in dialogue with one another gets to the heart of, I think, it's a useful word and a useful set of dynamics and useful tension at getting to a lot of the specific kinds of things that we've been thinking about how we're going to have to break with the past in radical ways, but how in breaking with that past, we enter into a kind of a circular way of thinking about our relationship to past generations, to other cultures, to animals and plants who we don't immediately identify as human. And I think those two things together, embodied within the word revolution, can kind of get us away a little bit more explicitly from just simply reiterating capitalist, colonialist kinds of sort of visions of balance, if you will. And then one other thing, I'm just going to throw this out and then I'm going to move over, just one kind of random, just maybe bizarre sort of thought that came to mind when I thought about this notion of decolonizing nature. I'm still struggling with what that really means. And it seems to me that a lot of us here have been speaking for nature in one way or another, which to a certain extent is kind of a colonial move. We are presuming as people in this room to speak to a larger set of relationships in which we're only partially connected, in which we only have partial control, and in which historically we've sought to have increasing control. When I think of decolonizing nature, I wonder, it raises the question to me, and the question is, can we imagine a way of seeing and being in the world in which non-human nature can also speak for us? And it's probably more of a philosophical question than anything else. But I think those are the kind of imaginative questions that we have to ask if we really want to kind of take this notion of decolonizing nature seriously. So I think I'll stop there.
Going in order.
We're going in order?
Are we?
Yes,
Okay.
we are.
A couple of things to start off with for those of you that attended my talk and Q&A and attended today. You have to admit, I've been put on the spot a lot. I've been a good sport too, so I just wanted to put that out there. A second thing is, some of the other folks, I'm going to talk generally and not really refer to any particular talks, and we'll do some bragging and some criticism, but I'm not I'm not like trying to be passive aggressive against any particular person's talk. For those of you that know me, I hate passive aggressive. Like that's just makes my blood curdle. It's like the worst thing ever. So I'm not necessarily referring to anybody's particular talk. So I wanted to start off with just I guess there's a couple of things I wanted to discuss. One is the scholarship that ought to go along with a topic such as decolonizing nature. And then I was going to also, the second part, kind of do my own opinions about decolonizing and nature, and a lot of folks have said some excellent things. So with regard to the first part that I was going to share, so the biggest thing that I took away is, man, the indigenous scholars were like fantastic. I mean, the indigenous scholarship here was incredible. It was fantastic. Then there was that guy whose slides didn't work, right? So it was incredible, and there's a lot of stuff I want to highlight about it. But so the first thing is that all of those presentations, they weren't doing the thing where it starts from some white scholar figurehead or some Indian male patriarch, or trying to unravel through investigation and typical scholarly tools some particular issue. This was scholarship that the theory was democratic, it was reciprocally relational, it drew from all sorts of different types of testimony, from somebody's grandma or cousin to somebody in academia, to somebody whose voice has been completely silenced in the archive, which takes a lot of talent to be able to recover and inherit those voices, to much more that I'm going to get carried away if I go into detail about that type of scholarship, that type of reciprocal, responsible scholarship. That takes talent, that takes a lot of time, and then the ability on top of all of that to come in there and express it crisply and clearly and deftly, and in a way that's engaging, and in a way that is simultaneously a kind of rigorous scholarship, but also an expression of one's experiences in the world. That was awesome, and that's the type of scholarship I think that we want to promote when we take on these concepts like decolonizing nature. That's the kind of scholarship that's going to carry us through, because it's a scholarship that is different from, say, an investigation of history, or investigation of an ancestor, an investigation of this future. This is a scholarship that's actually a dialogue, an interactivity between present, ancestors, future, right? It's one conversation, to the point, right, where actually some folks who are doing the former kind of scholarship acknowledged, whether it's in conversations or up here on the panels, that people doing the latter kind of scholarship had actually been doing everything they wanted to do, and they wanted to tap in and learn more about how to do that. And I think that's one of the important things about just how fantastic that indigenous scholarship was. And by the way, it wasn't only like senior, indigenous studies scholars. It was like people that are just starting out too, and they were doing it like, oh, well, I'm not doing it like way better, right? So that's the point that I wanted to make about scholarship. Now, I guess still related to that, but in terms of these notions, I see they took down the poster, decolonizing and nature. So yeah, I mean, these are not fantastic terms to start off with, but I think that's part of why a lot of us showed up. I mean, the one thing I think is funny about like decolonizing is like the best example I can think of decolonization is the United States, right? Like the worst power in the world is actually a decolonial project in a pretty sick sense. And so, right, already when that's like one of your shining examples of decolonization, it can get a little bit frustrating. And so, in that sense, right, when you think about, well, why is it problematic to think about the U.S. as a decolonial project. It brings up all these other things that we were discussing. As a Native person, from a community, I mean, one of the most frustrating things is, looking at all these different, explicitly or not explicitly, but this is what they meant, these decolonial projects where there's a cultural revitalization project that was really just going to end up being run by patriarchal men that oppressed women and two-spirit persons within our society. And so you see all of these failed attempts at decolonization that then just sort of mask the fact that many people simply subscribe to values and forms of oppression and other bad things that are going to keep us in our place and or keep us in a situation that's not that great. And so the idea of thinking critically about decolonization is, a sort of a shocking idea. But so that's one thing. A second thing is about nature. Nature, at least as it ended up getting taken up by a settler state like the United States, was actually one of their greatest technologies of erasure. What they did with that notion of nature, where you can just literally erase millions of people, histories of all kinds. You can actually look at a land that doesn't really look like that, but you see it as nature. I mean, that's a powerful technology of oppression. And so then you're starting off with nature, and it's like, man, that's a crazy starting point, right? Because we're thinking about decolonizing something which, at least in terms of what I can remember, was actually deployed as one of the greatest technologies of settler colonialism. And one of the things that you see and I heard this throughout the event, is that even among a lot of folks that are actively pursuing the project of decolonizing nature, there are still those moments where you see the pictures which are engineered in a particular way, where you don't see any human or non-human governance, no plant and animal microbiota governance in the picture. Or those references that people make where you see they really do love the outdoors and the wilderness. I can't emphasize enough that even if many of us might have grown up having those sentiments and those feelings, that is screwed up, right? That is messed up. There's no possible way that you can have that desire or motivation without having something that's seriously wrong with the way that you're approaching the world. And I'm not saying that the way that I approach the world is fantastic either, but we're not talking about me here. Right? It's messed up, and there's no way out of that. And so it is important to, when we challenge notions like what decolonizing means, when we challenge the sickness of that desire to be in wilderness or the outdoors, even in the course of a presentation that seeks to be critical about that. When we get into that, what we find are things that can begin to help us figure out what we're doing, right? When we think carefully about dispossession of human, non-human, indigenous people, plants, and animals, we get into the fact, right, that when we talk about like Native people caring for the environment, that wasn't an overnight process. It was built on millions per society of relationships built on many, many strong qualities. And it took actually the Europeans and the US also many hundreds of years to develop the capacity to overthrow that. And so when we look at the details of all that went in to just being able to be born as somebody who actually cared about the environment and about stewardship, we realize there's a lot of work we can do right now to restore those types of relationships, including things like I talked about in my talk: trust, consensuality, ecological redundancy, those things which make it possible to even be motivated. So it's not enough to just say we need to be motivated to, steward the environment or to care for it or things like that. There's a whole lot there about what types of relationships must underwrite that. So we can't just say it's about relationships or we need more relationships. Not what the types are, because we know those can just be co-opted by people that are patriarchs or oppressive in other ways, right? Types of relationships, that's so surface level. What are the qualities of relationships? And that's just how I talk about it. You all can talk about it in way better ways. But that gets us into these deeper questions which take us to the core issues that are at stake when we engage in a scholarship around a concept as troubling as decolonizing nature. Thank you.
Kyle asked me if we were going to go in order, and I said yes, but now I realize I should have said no. You're a hard act to follow.
Oh, I thought you were going to say I took all your ideas.
No, you didn't. But he is a hard act to follow, but here goes. In my presentation, I talked about this organization, a global organization called Humanities for the Environment, which is a group of 8 observatories that is networking thousands of environmental humanists around the world. There's thousands of us. And so I'm not going to talk in this summation about decolonizing nature because so many people have already talked about that. So what I'm going to talk about is why the environmental humanities and why now. The environmental humanities brings us to this room, and about 4 years ago, when I went to a conference with Shabankar, and who I want to thank very, very sincerely for bringing us all together. I went to a conference, and it was a photography conference, and at that conference I said, we're all here, we're all environmental humanists, and all the photographers went, we're environmental humanists? And I said, yes, you're environmental humanists. And what is an environmental humanist? An environmental humanist is a philosopher, a literary critic, a film critic, a cinema studies scholar, an artist, a writer, all coming together with some sort of common desire to think about the future, to think about a future we want instead of a future we don't want. And other people have said this, and I'm going to say this again. Essentially what we've agreed to agree here over the course of these past few days is that we're all here to imagine something different. And how do you do that? Manuela asked, how do you imagine it? How do we think of it in different colors? And many of us have said, one of the things that we're doing is we're looking to indigenous peoples to help us imagine what that different future might be. And now I'm just going to I'm just going to talk about myself for just a minute, just to give you an idea of how I come to be an ally in thinking about a different kind of future we want. When I was in grad school, I got tapped just serendipitously to teach these classes for Native American retention. So for about 7 years, all my students, every single one of them, was Native American. They were Tana'atam, they were Lakota, they were Apache, they were Navajo, they were from the Pueblos. And so for 7 years in the classroom, I was the only white person in the room. And what those students taught me is that actually in graduate school, my professors couldn't teach me anything. I knew that we needed to be talking about something different, something that wasn't wilderness, but I didn't exactly know what it was. I had to get out of school. I had to be in my first job. My first job was 5 miles as the crow flies from the US-Mexico border. And in that place, I became acquainted with the comadres. The comadres are a group of women all across the U.S.-Mexico border who were organizing to oppose the oppression of women and others in the maquiladoras. It was just post-NAFTA, and there was drought in Mexico. People were starting to come north across the border, and these women were organizing to help people. They were organizing to help people figure out how to get across the border or how to live decent lives on the other side of the border. And I met one of the comadres of Sofia Martinez. You heard from Sofia this weekend. My ally, my comadre, was Teresa Leal, and she just barely passed away just a couple months ago. But one of the things that she taught me is, Joni, we are all tools in a toolbox, and we all bring our different sets of tools, our different ways of seeing things, and we put them in the toolbox, and I do this one thing, and you do this other thing, and together we're stronger by working together. The reason why she passed away is because she had asthma, and so she died of an asthma attack because she'd been gassed so many times, gassed and pesticide dropped on her in the fields with Cesar Chavez. She worked with Cesar Chavez, and then she would go to every single action there was, and she breathed tear gas so many times that she had asthma. So this is just a long way of saying that my teachers over time have not necessarily been the scholars that we read. And that's how I came to know that the word we were talking about, or the phrase we were talking about, was environmental justice. So much has been made about the coterminous development of Anthropocene studies and environmental humanities, but what I say is it was the environmental justice movement that taught us that we needed to come together as humanists to work for something that was different than just this notion of pristine wilderness. And over the course of the past 3 days, we've seen a number of presentations that have helped us think about this. I talked about food, but I learned about food from indigenous teachers, and I learned about amaranth from TOCA, which is Tona O'odham Community Action, which is revitalizing the O'odham food systems. I learned about corn over the course of my career. I learned that corn is medicine, food is medicine, and I learned that corn used to be a grass, and rice is a grass, and wheat is a grass, and that over the course of the Holocene, humans and plants work together, and most of these plants create oxygen, the oxygen we breathe. So over the course of the Holocene, humans and plants work together, creating oxygen, water, and food. And this is a different way of thinking about the place that we live, you know, that it's not just us in control of everything, rather we're always working in relation, as Kyle just said, in relation with non-human others, sentient beings, whether they're grasses or whether they're trees. And so for me, the resistance part of this conference was the focus on environmental justice. The focus on environmental justice is a very important focus. The resilience was the things that we've learned about food as a plant, food as a medicine. We learned a lot about food as a medicine from Dylan. And then finally, revitalization. The presentation on the dam was an example that we can change things. We are changing things. And why are we all here in this room? Because we give a damn. And maybe we'll give more dams as we go forward. Thank you.
Fewer dams. Do we have time? Is there time? Okay. Okay, thanks, Shubhankar. I'll keep it brief, though, because I can see a lot of you guys are struggling, and I'm really hungry. So, and also because, like, I can't answer your questions, Nick. Like, I picked out a couple of good questions in your talk, and, like, I can't answer them, but I also didn't come to this conference to get answers. I came to see how the process works, and it made me realize that, like, we're not going to be able to define, you know, what we mean by decolonizing nature, but that's because it's less important about the definition, right? Like, being able to define it's not going to solve any problems, but it's the process, and it's about getting there, and about how we figure it out. So I'm more interested in that, so I'm okay with the fact that this is really, there's a lot of contradictions, and it's kind of ambiguous, and that's just really exciting to me. That means, like, we're actually doing something other than just, you know, paying lip service. Okay, so, but I would like to make a couple comments, but I want to let you guys know that I'm addressing the students in this room, but I think I'm making a safe assumption that, you know, most people in this room are here by choice, and you're here because you're students or teachers of some kind. You consider yourself a student. And mainly because I think this conference was born out of Shubhankar's desire and a lot of our desire to decolonize the classroom. And this is kind of fun, right? We're getting close. And as a student, I just wanted to maybe acknowledge the emotional impact that this conference has had on me, and I hope that since you guys are here and it means that you give a damn or fewer dams, that you're having an emotional reaction to. And I really appreciate that Dar let us into his world a little bit and revealed, you know, talked about the PTSD, and I'm not saying that I have that, but that it's okay to have an emotional response to it, right? Because we're hormonal, emotional primates. So I just wanted to encourage you guys to kind of face that head on. My friends, like, they just can't stand me right now, because every night this week I've just been, like, pouring my heart out to them, and I think they're just sick of it. But I just, you know, I wanted to acknowledge that it's impossible for me to leave this room without my emotions attached to me, and it's manifested itself into this, like, thing that I can't break up with. And the apprehension comes home with me, it crawls into bed with me, it's getting in the shower with me, which is encouraging me to take shorter showers. I can taste it in my food, and it's like tinting the screen on my phone. But I think that this kind of speaks to the success of this conference, and I hope that you guys feel the same way. And maybe if you want to get together and talk about how to deal with your emotions and how to use that as fuel to move forward and start, kind of sticking yourself into that process, whether they want you there or not. And it's a different perspective as a student versus, esteemed colleagues that I want to be on that side of the table someday, So yeah, those are kind of just my thoughts on it. I did learn a few things, like I learned about how to talk about resistance, the idea of resisting. I even wrote it down because it was bothering me so much, but the idea that like the more you educate yourself and the more we can educate others, we can resist control, we can resist face value, we can resist the perverted truth, we can resist the inner oppressor, resist colonialism, resist the status quo, resist the ego, and outlive the empire. I really like those. And just some kind of overarching like connective threads that I thought might be helpful just to remind people of, because I certainly didn't come up with these on my own. But first, to learn the language of resistance, and you can do that through decision making, so your choices of food, your speech, your choices to love, your choices to educate. I learned that resources are not managed, they are privileged. Holy crap. And I want to be careful, again, not to privilege the product over the process, right? Don't privilege the definition of decolonizing nature, privilege the process. And as students, don't privilege your degree, privilege the process of being in school, because if you're always chasing that degree, you're just wasting so much time. And then I want to reiterate something that Shubankar is always encouraging us to do, and that's to collaborate. And even if that doesn't mean like starting your own grassroots movements with people outside of your discipline, and as like Robert Newman told us like right off the bat, is that you can like crystallize the conversations that we're having here, and I think that's really important and probably the most fun I've ever had. Just these like weird little conversations that tend to connect, and they become actually really profound the more you can collect. So that's all I have to say. Thanks for listening.
Do we want to open it up for questions? Okay. I don't have anything else to say. I just want to give a round of applause to Shubankar for doing all this. And all of the panelists and the presenters that came, and also for people that did come here. And I do hope that after listening to everyone here, that we don't think of ourselves as like just like individuals and making like sort of individual decisions that are going to somehow reverberate, but thinking collectively as a collective whole and acting as a collective whole, so that we don't feel like we're alienated by ourselves and like feeling that we're the only ones feeling those things. But I hope that this space created that sense of community for at least a fleeting moment. And yeah, now you can go annoy your family and your friends with everything you learned here. So
do it
thanks
carefully.
So much, and Doksha, okay.
Yeah, you were like my second one. But I said my first one.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Okay, very quickly, we've got the shuttle bus for the moderators, panelists, at the same location where we've been dropped off